Welcome in, friends, to Betting Pros College Football Early Look Week 14. It is the conference championship time. I am Chris Welsh, joined by Thor Nystrom. You can find Thor at ThorKU on the Twitters. And Thor, our last show, I got to come and pinch hit, at least you and I. You will be doing plenty as the bowl games come in. And as far as I know, at least for the early look of what we're doing, I very, very, very much enjoyed doing these with you for close to half of the season. But this is our last one together, my friend.
Yeah, it's bittersweet for sure. But yeah, I've enjoyed doing these too. We had an awesome college football Saturday yesterday, and we've had some very interesting lines drop today for the conference title games. And we've already started seeing some line movement, as you and I were talking about before the show.
Yeah, we spent a little bit of time going through it. You know, one of the games we spent a decent amount of time talking with last week, and you did a really, really impressive breakdown, was the Michigan-Ohio State game. And you were talking about how much that Michigan side was really playing in. And what a game for the 2 and 3, and Michigan pulls out the outright win. Thoughts just coming off of one of the biggest games of the year, one of the biggest rivalries in all of sports. I mean, just all the implications coming out of it from Michigan beating Ohio State.
Well, from a selfish perspective, my impression was I had an enormous bet regret about it because,
let's say money.
Yeah, like we talked about last week, I was all prepared to pick Michigan to win outright. Certainly take them with the points, obviously, and stuff like that. But then the Blake Corum thing, it just got the injury thing, and then Donovan Edwards, his backup, had missed the previous game, and so I just got too in my head about it, and I decided to stay away. But Ohio State, as we have been talking about now for a month, has just been begging to get beat by anybody, and Michigan didn't even need Blake Corum to absolutely annihilate them on their home field. Michigan ran the ball better, they passed the ball better, they defended the run better, they defended the pass better, they turned the ball over less, they had less penalties, they had more yards per pass, they had more yards per run. I mean, like across the board. They point to one area where Ohio State acquitted itself well in that game. So kudos to Michigan, and especially doing it without Blake Corum. Obviously had enormous playoff implications and had even perhaps bigger implications on the Heisman race, where CJ Stroud, coming into last week, he was still the favorite to win the award. By the time we got done yesterday with the action, Caleb Williams was something like minus 4,000. He is way beyond the prohibitive favorite at this time. The books are just telling us that Caleb Williams is going to win the Heisman, and crazy things would need to happen this weekend for that not to happen. So just a crazy game with all sorts of enormous implications going on with it.
Do you remember like a switch like that, paying attention to the books for the Heisman race? Because I saw you tweeting about that. I mean, that was like a close thing. And then all of a sudden, bam, Caleb Williams just demolishes the odds across the board. Do you recall kind of a move like that in like the final week of the season pre-conference championship?
Well, maybe if you took it over the week, by and large, but just in the several hours, no, I'd never seen anything like that, because Caleb Williams went from essentially even money to begin the day to win the Heisman. He was minus 3,000 by the time the Ohio State game got done. But the USC game, it hadn't even kicked off against Notre Dame. We were still a couple hours away from that kickoff, and his odds had just gotten really crazy. And it was a bizarre sort of proposition where you're thinking about it in real time, and it's like, well, if Notre Dame upsets USC and Caleb Williams doesn't play well, now the guys there's going to be guys behind there that are just going to shove up the board or whatever. But if Caleb Williams and USC, if they hold serve in this game, the odds are going to get even crazier in Caleb Williams' favor, and that's obviously what ended up happening. But no, I'd never seen something like that, where a kid goes from plus 100 to win an award to minus 3,000 in the course of a couple hours when he has not yet taken the field.
Yeah, I saw a couple of people I follow note that, like, they're like, 3 hours ago, I just got, even money on Caleb Williams to win the Heisman, and now the odds have gone through the roof. It was pretty wild. So you literally up until like 2 days ago could have taken it, or as we're recording this, you could have taken advantage of that, and now that is out the window. That's outsies the window. So let's talk about the games. Let's get the early look. Obviously, the games are tapering down because we've got conference championships across the board. We've got a couple on Friday. We've got a whole set on Saturday. And we're also going to highlight, as Thor has already got some early lines locked up for some of these games. But let's start with the Friday games, and let's go over to the Conference USA Championship. Thor, where North Texas is taking on UTSA. UTSA 10-2, 8-0 in the conference. North Texas is 7-5. You saw a very, very nice advantage early on this. And UTSA, you have an adjusted spread that is over 10. The line is looking like it's sitting around 8.5. So talk to me about UTSA in this game.
Yeah, I thought the books dropped this line too low. When it came out, it was UTSA -7.5. I bought the ticket right then. Like you mentioned, the thing has moved a point in the last, hour and a half, 2 hours since then. And I expect this one to get closer to double digits by the time we kick. I think a part of the reason that the books were a little bit gun shy about it maybe was UTSA was sort of playing patty cake with UTEP yesterday. Very similarly, ironically, to what UTSA had done the year before in the exact same spot against these North Texas Mean Green. In that game, North Texas ended up beating them, but UTSA turned around the next, and UTSA was a double-digit fave in that game, just like they were yesterday on Saturday. But UTSA turned around the next week and won the Conference USA Championship. They beat Bailey Zappi and the high-flying WKU Hilltoppers. The UTSA did the exact same thing this time around. This time around, they did end up winning. They had fallen down to UTEP like 21-0 or 24-0. Or they dug themselves this enormous hole, but then they sort of roared back, and at the end, they won it by a field goal. Definitely not concerned about that. It doesn't have any bearing on this week. North Texas, by the way, they barely snuck by another 5-6 team that needed to win to go into bowl season in Rice. And so that, it's sort of a similar thing there, although Rice was down to, they're down on their backup quarterbacks, whatever. For me, this line should be -10, -10.5, -11, somewhere in that range. Anything beneath 10, I'm playing UTSA.
Okay, that was going to be my big question. Is like, if this thing moves to 9 or 9.5, you're still totally comfortable taking this line as the week moves on?
The fire point is beneath 10 for sure on UTSA. Yep.
Okay, and I love absolutely watching them anytime I can. So there you go. Thor's got his bet in. The 8-0 UTSA team is a play anything under 10, which you still got right now. Now, one of the biggest games of the entire run here is obviously we're just talking about the theoretical Heisman winner in Caleb Williams. USC and Utah are facing off in a Pac-12 championship game. USC is 11-1. They're 8-1 in the Pac-12. Utah's coming in 9-3, 7-2. In the Pac-12 is a big matchup. This will be the big highlighted game. And the early line is really interesting because when you spit out your stuff, you had pretty much a pick 'em. This line, though, is moving and sitting around 1.5. And I don't think it's actually moved as I've gone through this. Now, it looks like it's still sitting at 1.5. So even though it's a pick 'em, what do you think about USC versus Utah?
Yeah, so I shared some of my bets that I made earlier today with you, and I locked in 5 of them. This one, I'm leaning towards Utah's side ever so slightly, but there's no reason to pull the trigger on it early because there is a shot this thing gets to USC -3, or who knows, maybe we even cross our fingers and hope it gets to 3.5. But where the line is right now, if you're interested in Utah, there's no reason betting it early in the week. Let's just wait for the market to push it over to the USC side. So I'm waiting on it. But like you said, I have the game as a pick 'em, and now the market's got a 1.5 and 2 for USC, and we'll see if it keeps going the other way. But as you mentioned, it's a fascinating rematch, right? USC's looking at the record, and they have that little 1 in the loss column. That came courtesy of Utah. Now, that game was in Salt Lake City, and it was a wild one. USC had pulled ahead early, and then Utah roared back at the very end and won by a point. Caleb Williams absolutely went off in that game. Travis Dye had a really good game as well. Travis Dye, he's out for the season, but the backups, the 2 and 3 for USC are pretty solid. They've acquitted themselves pretty well so far. In the last game, and this is going to be a big point of emphasis for USC this week, they let Cam Rising go absolutely ape crap, and he went berserk in that game. 475 yards of total offense, and then Dalton Kincaid, Utah's tight end, he had 16 catches for 234 yards and a touchdown. USC is going to have to address that. USC has had problems with tight ends all year, and Utah goes to the tight ends about as much as any offense in America. We saw it yesterday with USC against Michael Mayer. I was all over the Michael Mayer over props, and they got there pretty early. USC had given up 3 touchdown catches to Michael Ezeki. So I think Utah is going to try to do a pretty similar thing on offense. Utah, I mentioned that USC will not have Travis Dye. You have to mention Utah is not going to have Tavion Thomas. Their RB1. Utah had gone to more of a platoon thing, so maybe it's not quite as concerning. But Tavion Thomas is a really good player. He had suffered a foot injury or a toe injury a couple weeks ago, and announced he was just going to declare for the draft and walk away from the team, not try to push it or whatever. With totally his prerogative, but you do have to mention that as well. It's a really fascinating matchup. Like I said before, it was decided by 1 point last time. The total yardage in the last game, 562 for Utah, 556 for USC, about as close as you can get in a shootout. And USC fans, I'm contractually obligated for USC fans to mention that they have a gripe about that game because of a late roughing the passer penalty that they have still not forgotten. USC that extended a drive for Utah and allowed them to eventually take the lead. So you have that. And also you have to mention in the previous game, Jordan Addison got nicked up in that game and had to leave. So USC was not with his services at the end of it. It's a fascinating one, but Utah is one of those teams that USC does not want to see because they're a team that their strengths sort of go into USC's weaknesses. We saw that the first time around. It's going to be a fascinating rematch where if USC wins this one, they're punching their ticket into the college football playoff.
And the new voting or the new lines have not set as far as top 25, but USC was 6, Utah was 14. So you can see the impact of this big matchup. So if this moves to 3.5, this is a jump on Utah bet. If it doesn't, is this going to be kind of a stay away?
But beneath, I mean, I'm going to be leaning towards Utah either way. But when it gets to 3, that's going to be my trigger point, unless I feel like the way that I'm reading the market that it could get to 3.5. Because obviously you're taking a risk at that point if you wait, because then it could toggle back to 2.5. You might not see a 3 again. So it'll just be dependent on the market read. But 3 is where the decision we have to start thinking real hard about that. And then 3.5 for sure would be, yeah, that's a no doubter.
Well, with the conference championships, if you want to track all of your conference championship wagers in one place, check out Betting Pros Pick Tracker, bettingpros.com/pick-tracking. Syncs up your sports books. It'll tally which picks hit, which miss, and it'll give you live looks at what the public is doing in real time. Go get on the leaderboard and quickly become sharp by using the free advice we've got for you over at bettingpros.com/pick-tracking. Do it. One of my favorite teams to watch this year for everything they've done. I was telling you off air that I had a pretty party hectic Thanksgiving that took me down a couple notches, Thor. But usually I would get my bets in, but I was sleeping a little bit later and maybe recovering a little bit more. This was the number one team I wanted to bet on Saturday, and it's TCU. And TCU is going in to the Big 12 championship, facing off against Kansas State. This is another one of those, theoretical top 15 teams, as Kansas State was 12, TCU was 4. Early lines, I know you've got a bet on this right now. The early lines has got TCU as a 2.5 point favorite. All they do is win and cover. So what say you about TCU? Who are you locking in?
I locked in TCU at that 2.5 number. I didn't want it to get up to 3. My adjusted line on this game is TCU minus 3.6. So I do think that there's line value beneath 3. Even at 3, I'd be okay with that. But getting the 2.5, that was the no doubt lock in point for me on Sunday here. I we've seen this one before. It's another sort of fascinating rematch. October 22nd, Kansas State was up by 18 points on TCU. TCU ends up roaring back and winning that game. But it's another one where the opposing fan base is like, yeah, but we have to add some context here. Adrian Martinez had gone down in that game for Kansas State. Will Howard played really well in relief. And of course, we're going to see Will Howard here because Adrian Martinez is now injured again, whatever, not going to play. But in that game also, Will Howard got injured at the end of the third quarter. Kansas State had to bring in their third string quarterback and he only threw one pass. That pass was intercepted by TCU. So some of that stuff was obviously not great for Kansas State. Kansas State even entered that game sort of injury riddled because they had played this really rough and tumble game with Iowa State a week or two before that. And then Deuce Vaughn got, nicked up in that game. There was just a bunch of injury stuff going on their side, but it was another example of TCU sort of seizing the moment, being resilient. And then when they got that opportunity, it's like a race car driver going around the track and you finally see the crack of where you can get in. TCU has been accelerating through that crack every single time it opens. They did it in that game, and we've seen it over and over again. TCU ended up having 105 more yards of total offense than Kansas State in that game. But again, the injuries were a factor. And then as far as injuries now, TCU is a team that has been banged up in recent weeks, but they've gotten some good news. Kendre Miller, their stud running back, he came back in the last game against Iowa State. He had like 15 or 16 offensive touches and looked pretty good. So you can consider him 100%. Davis, the outside speed receiver for TCU, the speed merchant kid, he did come back last week after missing time. Played limited snaps, but he did have one catch for 14 yards. TCU obviously hoping that he'll be 100% this week. Quentin Johnston, who came into last week, that he is the stud on the TCU team, a potential top 10 overall draft pick. He came into last week with injury concerns. We thought he might be able to play against Iowa State. That was the indications that we gotten. He ended up not playing, which I found a little bit curious. Sonny Dykes, right after the game, though, addressed this, which is one of the things I like about Sonny Dykes. He tells you a little bit more than the Mike Gundys of the world and stuff like that about the player injuries. But Sonny Dykes basically said Quentin Johnston could have played. He was able to play today, but we figured if we didn't need him for this game, that we would just let him have the week and then get him even more healthy for the Big 12 title game. It sounded sort of like going back to Gundy, the scenario that he had with Spencer Sanders a couple weeks ago, where he actually needed to bring Spencer Sanders in to finish out that game and get a W. TCU was controlling the game against Iowa State right from the jump, so they didn't need to send in Quentin Johnson, but Quentin Johnson was dressed and ready to play. I would have to assume, based on all the context I had from last week and then Dykes' comments right after the game addressing this, that Quentin Johnson is going to be playing against Kansas State. What percentage is he going to be? I'm not sure, but Dykes clearly believes that he improved that percentage by not playing him last week. So we'll see on that, but they're getting back their sort of singular offensive talent. Nobody in America can cover that kid one-on-one just because of the physical gifts he has. So he's going to provide a little bit of a puzzle for Kansas State. But for me, any number beneath 3, I'm taking TCU on that.
Over in the MACC championship, Ohio's hosting Toledo. Ohio 9-3 on the year, 7-1 in the MACC. Toledo is 7-5, 5-3 in the MACC, but Toledo is a 3.5 point favorite currently. You have a little bit of value on the adjusted line in favor of Ohio. So what say you on the MACC championship?
Yeah, just a little bit. I have Toledo minus 2.9 points. So basically Toledo minus 3, and it's at 3.5 in the market right now. I'm fine with that. This is a game where this game would have been so much more fun to watch about a month ago when both the starting quarterbacks for both teams were healthy, because they're both studs, Curtis Rourke and Daquan Finn. I don't think, we're definitely not going to see Curtis Rourke because he's already been ruled out for the season on the Ohio side. I don't think we're going to see Daquan Finn either. Toledo tried to rush him back last week, and Daquan Finn looked absolutely awful. Like he should still be in the trainer's room or a hospital room or something. They had to yank him, not because he made the injury worse, but just because he was so ineffective on the field. Threw a couple interceptions and just couldn't do anything through the air. And then his mobility was compromised too. He was seen in a walking boat. Maybe even in the second half, but certainly after the game, it would be a surprise to me if Daquan Finn is able to turn around 7 days later and where they're going to have to feel better about his health status than they did last week, because they saw what happened last week when they tried to play him. It really set them behind the 8 ball in that game. So it looks like we're going to get the backup quarterbacks on both sides. So I figured we better talk about those kids. The one that I prefer is I think that there's less of a downgrade on the Ohio side than the Toledo side, because the Tucker Gleason kid, he's the backup for Toledo. He's not acquitted himself well when he has had to be in, which is the reason that Toledo rushed back Daquan Finn last week. But Tucker Gleason, when he came in for Finn, I mentioned how poorly Finn was playing last week. So they're like, okay, we can't play you anymore, Finn. We have to bring in Gleason. So they bring in Gleason. Gleason goes 13 of 38. Do that math in your head really quick. Not good. For 200 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. And he obviously does not have the legs that Finn does. Gleason went 1-1 in his 2 previous starts when he, for an injured Finn, 27-24 win over EMU, 42-35 loss to Bowling Green, but last week did not acquit himself very well. The kid for Ohio is a little bit more interesting. Their backup, his name is CJ Harris. He went 10 of 21 last week, 196 yards and a touchdown, but he added 65 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns. Basically, you can think of CJ Harris as an enormous downgrade from Curtis Rourke as a thrower, but CJ Harris is a better runner. Now, does that make up the value? No, but it makes a partial of the value. I just don't think he is as big of a downgrade as going from Finn to Gleason. And so maybe that, I should bake that a little bit more into the line. I'm not sure. We'll see as the statuses go on this week, if it's going to be Finn or if it's, if it's going to end up being Gleason. But if Finn is not playing this game and it is Gleason, I just don't think that I could trust Toledo with a bet.
Now, I think this was, from our conversations beforehand, I feel like this was one of your favorites of the week because there's a lot of value. This bad boy is the Sun Belt Championship. Coastal Carolina is going up against Troy. Troy's 10-2, 7-1. Or I'm sorry, did I say? I think this is the Sun Belt. Yeah, this is the Sun Belt Conference. I don't even know if I said that correctly. The Sun Belt Conference, they're 7-1. Coastal Carolina 6-2 in the Sun Belt. They're 9-2 overall record. This line that we've currently sitting at is between 7.5 and 8. That is not the line that you got. That is not the line that you saw, and that is not the adjusted line. So I know you like Troy in this one. Talk about your path on betting early on Troy.
Yeah, I definitely do. My adjusted line on this game is Troy minus 11.4, and it looks like the line now is up to Troy minus 8.5. I was able to punch it in at Troy minus 7.5. I was mentioning to you before the show, it's so rare when you have a bet regret on the same day, but I do with this game because earlier today when I was, I'm always refreshing my books to see when they'll drop the line. And when they first dropped the line, it was Troy minus 5, which is one of those where I was like, I sort of got blown back in my seat. And so I was like, well, that must mean Grayson McCall's coming back. Because that's the only thing that could explain that big of that was a 6.5 point discrepancy from what my line is. So I spent the next 40 minutes researching, like doing the deepest of dives into Grayson McCall's status. And then when I came back and felt okay about my read of that, it had already toggled to Troy minus 7.5. And so I was just hitting myself for not locking that one in early. I did lock it in at 7.5. It's since moved to 8.5. So we're going to end up with some line value on that, especially because if McCall is not announced his back, which is what you would expect right now, I'll get into that in a second. If he's not playing this game has got to be Troy by double digits by the time we get to kick, whether it's 10, whether it's 10.5, or whether it's even closer to my line of basically 11.5. The backup for Coastal Carolina has been just abysmal ever since he took over. I thought it was going to be this Bryce Carpenter, the kid who'd been his backup before, but they've been playing this kid called Jarrett Guest. Jarrett Guest in his in his 43 attempts this year, I guess, 44.2% completions, 302 yards, and a 1-to-4 TDI&T ratio. Compare this with Grayson McCall's career stats. Grayson McCall 28-3 as a starter. Grayson McCall has completed over 70% of his passes as a starter, so almost 30% more than the backup in his admittedly smaller sample. But Grayson McCall 74-7 TDI&T ratio, and he broke Mac Jones' single season FBS record for passing efficiency last year. He also is a better runner than this Guest kid. So not only does Coastal's running game get worse, their passing game drops off the biggest of shelves. And so you've seen these past couple weeks when it's been Guest that he started 2 games now. It was against Southern Miss, and then last week against James Madison. Against Southern Miss, he was not very good. They managed to squeak by because Southern Miss struggles on offense. Coastal won that game 26-3. Then the Coastal was supposed to play Virginia. That game obviously got canceled because of the tragedy at UVA. But then last week, Coastal just gets annihilated by James Madison, 47-7. James Madison has a really good run defense, so they shut the lights out on that part of Coastal's offense. And the Jarrett Guest kid obviously cannot throw. And so, I mean, Coastal just, they were looking around like, where's Grayson McCall? We can't do anything. Was basically what happened there. That makes this one tough if Grayson McCall doesn't go, because Troy has a really good defense and they can do the same thing of shutting down your lights in the running game. If they do that and make Coastal play one-handed with the pass, again, if it's Jarrett Guest again, Coastal is really going to struggle to put up points, and Jarrett Guest will turn that ball over. So the big question about this game, will Grayson McCall return? So I did the deep dive. Like I said, I've gone through the quotes. I've Zaprudered the whole thing. So when Coastal announced that Grayson McCall was going to be out with his foot injury, they said his recovery timeline is 3 to 6 weeks. This game on Saturday, the Sun Belt Championship, will be played 3 weeks and 3 days to the day after that was announced. So if Grayson McCall is back, it will be on the extreme front end of that recovery timeline. Most people, when it came out, they reported it as he's going to be done at least until bowl season, and we'll see if he can come back during bowl season. But again, we did have that sort of finite recovery timeline that they had tossed out, which this game technically would fall in. Again, on the front end, but it would fall in. During my deep dive, I did not find anything else that has been stated about this. I didn't see any, the coach coming out and being like, yeah, he's going to play or expressing optimism about that. It's going to be one where we need to parse the quotes on the Coastal Carolina side the whole time, or maybe they'll just come out early in the week and rule them out, or go the other way with it. But right now, you would have to consider Grayson McCall very, very, very iffy to play in this game. Definitely less than 50%. We'll see. Again, we'll amend that as we go on through the week based on the quotes and the information that we're getting. But I had to bet this game as though there's, a 75% chance or better that it's going to be guessed. And if it's McCall, that would mean, again, he's on the front end of that recovery timeline from a foot injury. So then in your head, you're sort of modulating, okay, you got to take away Grayson McCall's rushing utility now, because if he's on the very front end of it, he's not going to be testing that foot any more than he has to. Probably going to be staying in the pocket, sort of like Bo Nix a couple weeks ago when he'd been running so much, but then they play, Utah or whoever they played a couple weeks ago, and he ended up being able to play, but he didn't run at all in that game. I don't even know if he had one. He definitely did not have a designed rushing attempt, but I also don't think he scrambled at all. That's what I think you would get if Grayson McCall is playing in this game. And then you would have to wonder, too, about the driving of the throws. That was another thing that we saw with Nix a couple weeks ago. There was at least one interception, the interception at the very end of the game. He tried to throw it across the field on a pass that he probably would have hit if he was healthy, but he couldn't get the oomph into it like usual. And by the time the ball finally got there, not nearly as quick as it would have been, the Utah guy, it had been telegraphed and it was on its way, and he was able to undercut it and intercept it. So whether we get Grayson McCall at 80% or 85% or less, or whether what it seems like more likely it's going to be guessed, I think there's value on Troy with this number being in the single digits still. And again, if Grayson McCall's ruled out, this thing's shooting Troy minus 10 or above really, really quickly.
How about the SEC Championship, which is your midday game over on CBS? It's the biggest line currently that we are seeing as we're recording this, looking like 16.5 coming into last week. This would have been a number 1, number 5 matchup. That's big dog stuff. 12-0, obviously Georgia is undefeated in the SEC, of course. LSU 6-2 in the SEC with a 9-3 record. And this is one of the 5 that you're jumping on, Thor. You have a bet already preset on Sunday with this Georgia team.
With Georgia, yeah. With that line being under 17, I expect the line to be 17 or probably a little bit above by kickoff. I think the fair line on that is Georgia minus 17.5. My adjusted line is Georgia minus 17.2. So, I mean, that's in part informing it, but I just feel like that would be the objectively fair line. So for, when it opens and it's beneath that, I'm pulling that, I want that ticket. So I bought it on Georgia minus 16.5. And again, I do expect it to go up. So if you're interested in Georgia and you see it beneath 17 whenever you hear this, that's where I would I would buy that ticket. I'm happy in this game. Welsh, we were talking about the past couple, and we had to do the quarterback injuries and all this sort of stuff. We don't have as many injury concerns in this one.
And the big dogs.
Yeah, and we definitely don't have any quarterback injuries in this one. We also do not have the context of a previous game played this year because these teams have not yet played. So it's going to be interesting watching these two teams feel each other out and stuff like that. Last week for both of them, it was sort of like Ohio State and Michigan the week before they played, so 2 weeks ago or whatever, when they both had the overlook, and they both absolutely overlooked the Illinois and Michigan's case and Maryland and Ohio State's case, and they both almost got beaten by doing it. But LSU, they actually got beat by Texas A&M. Now, A&M had Devin Achane back, so you have to give that for him. But LSU was very clearly overlooking that, and then A&M got the supercharger of getting their best player back, and so A&M just raced by them. And then Georgia, they clearly had overlooked too. Georgia Tech was only down 10-7 at halftime. Georgia Tech, their quarterback was that Zach Gibson kid that we've been making fun of all season because he ran out of bounds on the Hail Mary attempt. And he was the guy who was keeping Georgia Tech close. Now, Georgia Tech did end up pulling away. They scored 37 consecutive points after they fell down early. They ended up winning 37-14, but didn't even come close to covering in that game. I toss out the last week results. I don't think it's any sort of carryover, especially because there was no key injury suffered on either side or whatever. I just think objectively in a vacuum, this line should be Georgia minus 17.5, and I don't think it should be beneath Georgia minus 17. One thing potentially is, this is sort of a mindset thing, and so this is something I'm going to be digging into my handicap this week in this game. Probably as much or even more than the on-field matchup, because I can see these two teams playing in my head. I've seen these two teams play so many times that I know their strengths, I know their weaknesses, I know everything else like that. I'm curious about Georgia's mindset heading into this game in regards to this. Georgia, even if they lose this game, they're going to the college football playoff. So, but you never want to say the SEC title game doesn't mean anything, because of course it does. But the stakes are less for Georgia than I think they would normally be. And so does that play any sort of a factor, or is this, it's the SEC title game, right? Is there going to be any of that? But we have seen in recent years, teams in that scenario have played a little bit down. So that's something where I'm going to be looking into it pretty deeply to try to get a gauge of what sort of where Georgia's head is at heading into this one. And then on the LSU side, the pop psychology thing that you need to check in on is after last week, you're wondering if this is a deflate spot for them, right? Because heading into last week, they it was like, well, if there's chaos above us and we just hold serve, we just beat A&M. Now we're right on the doorstep. And heck, we beat Georgia in that SEC title game, the only game we will have played against them this year. Then we might be going to the CFP. That stuff's all gone now with the A&M thing. So because of that, does LSU play down any, or is it the SEC title game? They both play up. It's probably a wash in the handicap, but it is something that I'm going to be paying very close attention to on both sides.
The Athletic American Championship. We've got a big matchup on that one. UCF, who's 9-3, going up against Tulane, who's 10-2. 7-1 in the conference. Tulane's currently a favorite. I see a 3-point line. I think your early line, it looks like 3 is about the same line that's putting out there, but there's a little bit of an advantage. And this is the 5th and final, I believe, of the games that you have put early tickets in on. So talk to me about Tulane, who has got your vote.
Yeah, my adjusted line on that game is Tulane minus 4.4. The line came out beneath 3, so you knew I had to buy a ticket on it. I didn't want to take the chance that thing would get to 3, so I punched it in at Tulane minus 2.5. And by the time we even got on this record, it's Tulane minus 3 now. Now, I don't expect, that thing still could potentially toggle back to 2.5. I don't think that line this week will get up to where my line is. I don't see this thing getting to 4.5. I think you're going to see it right around that 3 number the whole time. Could it get batted to 3.5? Maybe. Could it come back to the 2.5? Maybe. But I think that's where you're going to see this the whole time. We've already seen this game played once, and it was in the same venue when UCF ended up beating Tulane earlier this season, 38-31 in New Orleans. This game is in New Orleans. It's one of those conference championship games that is hosted by the team with the higher seed or whatever. So Tulane ended up getting that by beating Cincinnati. We were on Cincinnati last week on Friday. They ended up winning that to get to this game. And when we were talking about Tulane and Cincinnati, we were talking about the motivation edge that was on the Tulane side, because Tulane hadn't in a million years won their conference championship or even played in one of them. They had never, it was not the AAC when they did. It was in 98 with the Conference USA. They have never appeared in an AAC title game. Tulane badly wanted that. They were talking about that all last week. We have to get into the AAC title. We have to get into the AAC title. They end up doing that. And then Cincy, I didn't even know that it came out today that Luke Fickell went to Wisconsin. Those guys must be pretty good at keeping secrets, because all these other coaches out there, even the ones that aren't taking jobs, they're thrown around and bandied about for all these different things. I didn't see anything about Fickell to Wisconsin, up until about 20 minutes before it was started to be reported as quasi-official. So that thing was just dropped on us. It seems like Fickell did a pretty good job. So, as far as with the team and with the rumors overall. So it doesn't seem like that thing ended up affecting Cincinnati at all. Tulane just was the better team. If you watch that game, going back to the earlier season matchup, like I said, UCF won that game 38-31 in New Orleans. The Knights outgained the Green Wave 468-391. UCF controlled the ball for 10 more minutes of game clock. And they also benefited, UCF did, from a 2-0 turnover advantage in that game. The one good thing that Tulane did a couple of things in that game that was decent. They held UCF. They totally shut down the passing attack. UCF only threw for 132 yards. But a part of that was because UCF was getting their rushing yards at will. UCF ended up running for 336 yards and 4 touchdowns. But here's where it gets interesting, and here's where it gets important, and here's where we get into the points of emphasis for Tulane this week. John Rice Plumlee in that game, John Rice Plumlee. I'm trying to get better at it. John Rice Plumlee, the UCF quarterback, the dual threat kid. He'd been at Ole Miss before, transferred over. He's also a baseball player. He is extremely athletic. In fact, at the end of his time at Ole Miss, he was playing wide receiver. It's part of the reason why he transferred to UCF, because he wanted to get back into the game as a quarterback. Dual threat kid, runs the Gus Malzahn offense really well, and he has all the physical tools for it. In that game against Tulane, he rushes for 176 yards and 2 touchdowns. Tulane, an enormous point of emphasis, the point of emphasis for their defense this week. How do we contain John Rice Plumlee better? How do we have a better containment plan for that? Whether it's the designed runs, whether it's the scrambles. Tulane figured out how to take away their passing attack the last time, which isn't that hard because John Rice Plumlee, the accuracy and the placement as a thrower are the knocks on his game. But obviously the good runner and Malzahn team are always good at running. They have a deep running back stable as well. But they had the most problems with Rice Plumlee. And so they have to figure out a way to do that. And then on the other side, so Tulane ends up throwing for 100+ more yards in that game on 1.7 more YPA. Tulane's running game actually only averaged a half yard less per attempt than UCF's did in that bonkers game that UCF had. But Tulane ran the ball exactly half as many times. It was 54 for UCF, 27 for Tulane, in part because of the turnovers by Tulane, in part because in the conversion opportunities, they didn't do as well. So UCF got the more opportunities. And then Tulane's defense, in part because of Rice Plumlee, what he was doing, they just could not keep them off a schedule and not force them to punt. So UCF ends up holding the ball for so much longer, et cetera. But it was still a game until the very end, obviously finished by the one possession. One big thing here for Tulane on offense, I think the thing for them on offense with the game script. Early on, they're going to want to go to Tyjae Spears a lot more than they did in the last game. I think they wanted to test it through the air a little bit more, and then the game script just got away from them. But in the last game, Tyjae Spears, he runs for 130 yards on only 8 attempts before Tulane had to just start throwing to try to get back into that game. Tyjae Spears, they want Tyjae Spears attacking the UCF front. This is a fascinating game, but like I said, just in a vacuum, having the line at Tulane minus 4.4 with my adjusted line against where this line started out beneath 3, that's absolutely a smash spot on Tulane for me in this game where they could get revenge. Again, haven't won a conference title since 1998. This is their first berth in the AAC title game. Absolutely, I'm taking that beneath 3. At 3, I would still bet Tulane. Tulane is going to be the side for me, but it's a fascinating rematch and a fascinating handicap.
If you believe in weird signs that exist out there, on my own sheet, I wrote Tulane versus Tulane equals Tulane favorite. So all those Tulanes are just a little bit of a sign that you bet that. All right, we got 3 more conference championships. The Mountain West Championship, no, I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm moving ahead of myself. The Mountain West Championship, Fresno State's going up against Boise State. I was playing that one out in my head, and we hadn't even talked about it. Boise State looking at a 4.5 line. Boise State 8-0. In the Mountain West. They picked up 8 of their 9 wins out of conference, and Fresno State's 7-1. They are 8-4 on the year. So Boise State with a little bit of a line, but I believe the adjusted line is pretty close. We're under a full point between your line and what is out there publicly. So any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, my adjusted line puts this one in the dead zone of Boise State minus 5.1. So right where it is, like moving from 4.5 to 5 is not really a change. So I don't see a ton of line value just in a vacuum on it. It's a very interesting handicap, though. Boise State is going to be one of those health status check teams this week. Last week, they were without 2 of their starters heading into the game. Stephen Cobb's probably their best receiver on the team, and then Riley Smith, their starting tight end. They were both out. And then during the game, one of their starting safeties, Tyreek Jones, was carted off the field with his own injury. I did look around at the Boise State beat reporters over the last, little bit less than 24 hours, trying to figure out the statuses of these three guys. It looks like there's a shot that they're going to get Cobbs and Smith back. I would consider that Jones kid highly doubtful from what I had heard and what I had read. They have not disclosed his injury, but it did not look good on the field. And the beat reporters are sort of insinuating that his season is over. It's a health status check thing. We got to check back and see if we get more information on that stuff. With that out of the way, the way you set this up was perfect. Both of these teams are on heaters. Boise has won 3 straight. They've won 7 of 8, and their entire season flipped when, number one, they fired their offensive coordinator and then brought back their old buddy Dirk Cutter to run the offense. And then when they kicked Hank Bachmeier, sort of the limited veteran, noodle-armed, heady pocket passer guy who had been their starter for 4 years, they showed him the door because they had this fresh, exciting, enormous dual threat from Texas that they seem to have pulled out. I don't know how they got this kid. They just Talon Green, I'm talking about. He's 6'6", like 220 pounds, and he's an awesome runner. As a passer, it's going to take him some time, but he has shown some flashes in that. But that's the part of his game that lags a little bit. But obviously, he's got the enormous frame and the dual threat ability as well. Ever since they put Talon Green in and they went with Cutter as the offensive coordinator, their arrow is just shot up, and they become more like the Boise teams from our past. So, like, you can basically toss out the first part of Boise's schedule when Bachmeier was the quarterback, because there's a couple games in there where literally they could not win because of the way that Bachmeier played. Specifically talking about the Oregon State game, where I think Bachmeier turned the ball over 3 or 4 times, like in their first 5 or 6 possessions. And by the time they finally pulled the plug on him in that game, they literally just could not come back in it. But ever since Talon Green took over, it has been a totally different story there. So that's the team that you want to handicap. And then on the Fresno State side, there's also contextual things to know about the quarterback situation. Fresno State is on a 7-game winning streak coming into this game. They started 1-4, and then they rip out the 7 wins. But they struggled because Jake Haener got injured earlier this season and missed 4+ games with his ankle injury. The backup Logan Fife for Fresno was just a guy, and Fresno devolved into being just a team, not like the good Fresno that we knew from Haener's time there earlier. But once Haener's come back and Haener's gotten fully healthy, now they've just become the Fresno of the past. So Boise's become what they used to be. Fresno become what they used to be. Fresno annihilated Wyoming, who is going to a bowl 30-0 this past weekend. So they proved the concept there. These two teams have played this year. In that game, Boise whipped Fresno State 40-20. This was on October 9th, and it was in Boise where this game will also be being played. But you have to add the enormous asterisk and put it in bold as well, and maybe neon flashing lights. That was one of the games where Jake Haener was injured. And so, it's just really not relevant to, anything the way that game played out is not relevant to the handicap of this game, because Logan Fife was the starter for Fresno. He played really, really poorly. That loss in that game dropped Fresno State to 1-4. Fresno State has not lost since. They are going to be chomping at the bit now to get a shot at revenge on Boise on the same field, now with Haener coming back. But again, Boise has gotten better and better and better as this Talon Green kid gets better and better and better. Fascinating handicap coming up this week on a game where the margins seem to be very low on Sunday with the line opens.
The last two here, they're going to be vying for your attention and your time. Both are at the exact same time. First up, it is the ACC Championship on ABC. Clemson going up against North Carolina. Clemson 10-2, undefeated in the ACC. They're 8-0. North Carolina 6-2. Clemson is looking like an 8-point favorite, and that is the line that you've got. So is there any edge? Is there any bet or anything to wait for in the ACC Championship?
Not for me right now. A couple of these games that we've talked about, I actually had legitimate discrepancies on it, and discrepancies big enough where I was called to action on pulling the trigger on them early. But this game, my adjusted line, like you mentioned, it's Clemson minus 8.2, and the line open, right now it's at 8. I don't see any line value on that. This game is in Charlotte, North Carolina, but don't go thinking that North Carolina gets a home field because of that, because I was doing the map quest today and figuring out they're exactly, Charlotte is basically in the midpoint between Clemson, South Carolina, and Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Both fans are going to have to drive an equal distance. And obviously Clemson has a ton of experience in these games, and North Carolina has a little taste of them as well. Not Drake May, though, their starter. My bigger issue with this game, not only do I not see much line value on it yet, well, we'll see what the market ends up doing with that. But it is so hard to get your finger on the pulse of either of these two teams. I don't trust either of them as far as I can throw them, and it's very hard for me to predict their performances. North Carolina, they were this extremely flawed team, they have the awful defense and they have a really strong, powerful offense. Drake May, their quarterback, he is a true freshman, but he is going to be the first pick in whatever draft class he comes out. Kid's just an absolute stud. He's either at this point, he might have dropped. I'm going to have to check the updated PFF grades, but I would be stunned if he has dropped out of the top 5 overall PFF graded quarterbacks this year. He's been in the top 3 all season long. The past 2 weeks, though, for North Carolina, they had gotten through all this other stuff. They'd started out 9-1. Some of these games where they were these wild shootouts where North Carolina, they always found a way to pull them out at the end. And then you're looking at their schedule and you're like, man, their last 2 games are pretty forgiving. They hosted Georgia Tech, and then they were going to play NC State, and NC State's 3rd or 4th or 5th string quarterback or whatever. And it's like, man, North Carolina is going to go into the ACC title game 11-1. Maybe we've got to start talking about them as a potential CFP team, like a dark horse bid or whatever. And then UNC just absolutely fell on their face against Georgia Tech in one of the more weird results of November. Georgia Tech wins that one outright. And then last week, you were hoping that you saw a bounce back from North Carolina. You really didn't get it. They did play better. That game went into overtime, and they essentially ended up losing a coin flip. It was 30-27, but you have to in double overtime. You have to bring up the context, though. NC State was using their 4th string quarterback in that game. So it's like, I know it went to overtime. I know it was close, but UNC, you really shouldn't be losing that game. And maybe they had look ahead, but they can't really argue that they had look ahead for 2 straight weeks. No one's vision goes that far. And then as far as Clemson, they're coming off their own embarrassing loss. They play South Carolina. South Carolina seemingly was in the biggest deflation spot of all time after they had just annihilated Tennessee. Spencer Rattler told the media after that game it was the biggest win, and I think he even said program history, which seems hyperbolic, but people were crying. The celebration went on in Columbia for days, and it's like, okay, if there's ever a hangover spot, this is it for South Carolina. Then South Carolina goes in and beats Clemson. Clemson did not acquit themselves well in that game. So what are you going to get from both these teams? Clemson has just been inconsistent all season. They've gone up, down, up, down, up, down. And then North Carolina, they seem to have it before, and then they've just lost it in recent weeks. You're going to have to figure out your gauge on that thing. Meanwhile, just on the status check stuff, Clemson's wide receiver, Bo Collins, one of their starters, he had missed some time before. He was able to come back for the last game from his shoulder injury against South Carolina, but he was pulled in the first half. He ended up finishing 2 catches for 65 yards, finished the game in street clothes. There must have been an aggravation of it, or he wasn't feeling good, whatever. I'm not sure, but he did not play in the entire second half. That would seemingly make him very iffy to play in this game, but you're going to have to check on his status this week. The other thing I'll bring up, RJ Mickens, starting Clemson safety, he is not going to be playing in this game until halftime. He got ejected in the second half with a targeting call. So by rule, he is disqualified from the first half of this game. We'll see. Both these teams, you have to feel good about where you can get on them. I don't see a ton of line value. This is going to be a game I handicap hard all week, and we'll see what I come up with.
Finally, the Big Ten championship, Michigan coming off that massive win. They're 12-0, 9-0 in the Big Ten, going up against Purdue, who's 6-3 in the Big Ten, 8-4 record, the second highest line. It was actually kind of floating right around that other 16.5. It's moved to 16, so it's right there, essentially the same thing. This is a big line, but is this another big win for Michigan? Is there a bet here for you on this bad boy?
I have not bet this yet because I'm waiting to see on the Blake Corum status. Blake Corum in that Ohio State game, he did play, and he said he was going to play. So, that was, good to see. But he only had 2 carries for 4 or 5 yards or something, or 6 yards. And then he spent the rest of the game on the sidelines. We need a status check on that. And Jim Harbaugh last week would literally tell us nothing. Didn't tell us anything about Donovan Edwards either. And Donovan Edwards is the guy that stole that show, sort of like Hassan Haskins did last year. That was more predictable because Hassan Haskins had been awesome the entire season. But Edwards, he's been RB2 to Blake, and Blake Corum has been, where at least was heading into last week, was a top 5 Heisman contender. Edwards has been very good, mostly as the pass catching back for Michigan, and then of course spelling Corum as well. But he got sort of thrust into that lead role coming off the injury. Like I said, the week before he had missed the game against Illinois, and Edwards hit this ground running. Edwards had a thumb injury where he had to wrap the hand up. I was wondering heading into that game, is that going to affect him, in his utility as the receiving back, or ball security or anything like that, or can they give him the usage that they would want to if Corum can't handle his regular usage or whatever. But Edwards looked awesome. He ran for over 200 yards. The 2 long touchdown runs that he had against Ohio State was basically what put the 2 nails in the coffin of Ohio State. You could tell both the crowd it totally took all the air out of there, and then you didn't have the energy there. This was even after the first one. But then the Ohio State team too just seemed totally deflated after those. And then Michigan, of course, completes their blowout of them. Edwards finished 216 yards and those 2 aforementioned touchdowns. The other thing you got to mention about Michigan, J.J. McCarthy just played awesome. His game seems to be going up and up and up. Obviously, this is his first year as a starter. He just absolutely shredded Ohio State, 263 passing yards, 4 total touchdowns. So we need to check on the status of Corum coming into this game. Looks like Edwards is more than good to go based on what we saw last week. On the Purdue side, they also had a running back health thing coming into last week. Their starting running back, Devin Mockabee, had missed time before that. He was able to come back, Mockabee, against Indiana from this head injury that he had suffered against Northwestern the game before. He ran in that game 99 yards and a touchdown on 15 carries. So Mockabee looks healthy for them. I did, even though my adjusted line is 2.5 points above where the market is on this, I credited Purdue with just a very slight home field advantage. It was less than a point, but I did credit Purdue just a little bit because obviously this game is being played in Indianapolis. It's closer to the Purdue side, but of course Michigan has a lot of experience in these spots as well. And Michigan, of course, you have to mention they have one of the best traveling fan bases in all of America, so it's not going to be lopsided by any means on the fan thing. In fact, Michigan may end up having more, but Purdue is not going to have to travel as far, and it's going to be a familiar surrounding for them. I'm showing the line value a little bit on Michigan right now, but again, I need to see what Corum's status is. I also, very similarly to the Georgia LSU handicap that we were talking about, I also need to check in on the Michigan, their mindset heading into this game vis-a-vis the idea that even if they lose, they are going to the college football playoff. And again, just like I mentioned with Georgia, that doesn't mean that they're just going to, roll the ball out like UTSA was doing last week, or a couple of those teams in those spots. You still want to win your conference title, of course, but are they going to hold anything back? Are they going to go just a little bit more vanilla with their game plans, not to put that on tape? Are there any players that are, 80%, 85, 90% that maybe you withhold in this one because you're sort of the heavy favorites in this spot? Those are a couple of things to look at there, but I'm going to dig into Michigan psychology with regards to that, and we'll handicap the heck out of this one. But I'm showing just a little bit of value on Michigan right now.
Free picks, player props, breakdowns. You got it when you're with Thor Nystrom and Mike Farrell. That's Game Day Live presented by DraftKings. Is it this last Saturday, or are you guys going to be going through the month of December? Is this the last one coming up?
So this is our last live Saturday morning show of the season, where we're going to go from, like we always do, 10 a.m. Eastern to 11:30 a.m. Eastern. But then after that, for bowl season, I don't even know if I can say this because I don't even know if anyone's announced this, but heck it, I share everything with the listeners out there, so I'll share this with you. We will be doing it for bowl season. It's not going to be on the Saturday mornings because you have the weird staggered stuff with the bowl schedule where it's on the weekdays and stuff like that. But we've set out a schedule that will deliver you guys multiple episodes of that with me and Mike live going through the whole gamut of the bowl games one by one. So we'll have several of those throughout. We will release that when we got it.
Awesome stuff. There you go. The final early look of the season. You can find him on Twitter at ThorKU. You can find me on Twitter at IsItTheWelsh. And Thor and everybody, thank you so much for letting me come in, talk some college football, getting some betting action in. This show has been invaluable, and I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Make sure that you subscribe to the Betting Pros channel so you're notified of all the stuff that is going on over here. And make sure you lock in on Saturday for the final one with Thor and Mike. For Thor, I am Welsh. You guys have a fantastic week and enjoy the conference championships.